Llevamos 8 meses en esta guerra contra las pandillas. 8 meses. Y gracias a Dios la estamos ganando. Estamos parados en lo que hasta hace poco fue la tierra más peligrosa del mundo. Y ahora estamos en camino a ser el país más seguro de todo el continente americano.
In the streets of El Salvador, a country marked by decades of violence and conflict, emerged a leader who challenges established conventions and fully immerses himself in the fight against the gangs and maras that have sown chaos. Nayib Bukele, the youngest president in the nation's history, has deployed a bold and multifaceted strategy to combat this scourge, addressing both the underlying reasons and the most visible manifestations of savagery in society. In today's video, we will explore in detail Bukele's method, the causes and consequences of his approach, as well as offer a detailed profile of this charismatic and controversial leader. To understand the magnitude of the challenge that the president faces in his fight against gangs in El Salvador, it is essential to contextualize the situation of violence that has marked the country's recent history. In recent decades, this nation has witnessed a bloody spiral generated by the presence of organized criminal groups known as maras, which have sown terror in urban and rural communities. These groups, such as Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18, have exerted territorial control through extortions, murders, and other criminal acts, making El Salvador one of the most dangerous countries in the world outside of war zones. Since the beginning of his presidency in 2019, Bukele has adopted an energetic and multifaceted approach to combat gangs and maras in El Salvador. His strategy is based on a combination of hardline measures, social reintegration programs, and crime prevention policies. One of the most prominent measures of his government has been the deployment of the armed forces and the National Civil Police in joint operations to dismantle criminal structures and regain control of territories dominated by these violent criminals. Before proceeding, it is necessary to analyze the underlying reasons for the virulence. Among the main causes of the proliferation of maras in the country are social exclusion, lack of economic opportunities, weakness of the rule of law, and institutional corruption. While state measures can have an immediate impact on reducing violence, they also raise concerns about human rights and respect for due judicial process. Only a personality with strong, charismatic, and, to some extent, dictatorial character could carry out this transformation. Let's get to know a bit about the president's profile. Young, charismatic, and with a bold vision for the future of his nation, Nayib Bukele, born on July 24, 1981, in San Salvador into a family of Palestinian origin, has emerged as a polarizing figure in Central American politics. His political career began in 2012 when he was elected mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlán, a municipality in the department of La Libertad. His tenure as a local leader stood out for its innovative and pragmatic approach, achieving significant improvements in infrastructure, public services, and governmental transparency. This, combined with his fresh and straightforward style, made him a popular figure among young people and urban sectors of the population. His impact on Salvadoran politics is undeniable. In 2019, Nayib Bukele stood out by becoming the youngest president in modern history of El Salvador, winning the elections with a resounding 53% of the votes. His victory marked a break in the traditional bipartisanship that had dominated the local stage for decades. Since the beginning of his term, Bukele has implemented an ambitious and controversial agenda focused on combating corruption, violence, and poverty. This figure has capitalized on his charisma and his ability to communicate directly with the population through social media, achieving truly surprising levels of popularity. However, his authoritarian style and tendency to govern through decrees have generated criticism and questioning from sectors of civil society, the international community, and the political opposition. He has faced accusations of lack of transparency and abuse of power. This is due to the inappropriate handling he has demonstrated with those accused of being members of the Maras. Let's see images of the humiliating treatment given to criminals. Exactly 1 year ago, the Terrorism Confinement Center, also known as CCOT, opened in El Salvador, a maximum security prison nicknamed the Alcatraz of Central America. The sensation of a dystopian reality transmitted by this place is fascinating, uncomfortable yet irresistible. It seems like a jail from the future. In this forgotten corner of the map, day and night blur into perpetual artificial light that bathes the cells in the inner courtyard. A closed circuit watches them relentlessly, like a silent god overseeing everything. Meals consist solely of beans and rice consumed with hands, as any utensil could become a lethal weapon. Their brief moments of freedom are reduced to a maximum of 30 minutes a day, chained and subdued under the relentless gaze of hooded police officers armed to the teeth. Most of the time, the inmates are alone with their thoughts, accompanied only by 2 Bibles per room. Despite the provision of these holy books, prisoners are denied spiritual assistance so that there is nothing to ease their burden. Through the bars, their shaven heads and tattooed faces peer into the void, trapped in a maze of concrete and barbed wire. The desire to escape fades in the face of the imposing presence of impenetrable walls and the gravel ground that would betray their steps if they ever decided to risk it all for freedom. In this place of darkness, love and passion are blurry memories, as visits and phone calls are a denied privilege. Let's listen to the chief of CCOT speaking about the facilities.
Área de construcción 34 manzanas. Cada uno de los módulos ha sido equipado con sistemas de emergencia de manera independiente. Es que el CCOT prácticamente, todo su sistema de seguridad está diseñado bajo los estándares internacionales. Un sistema para funcionar con un régimen de máxima seguridad.
In various interviews with Bukele, one can perceive the pride he has when talking about this place. In less than 20 months since assuming his first term, the young and controversial president managed to dismantle the 2 main and most terrifying gangs in the country, the aforementioned Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18. These 2 groups, whose members were hitmen who kept society in the grip of their murders and violence, have been dismantled by the controversial but effective Bukele method. With a state of exception that has deployed the army in the streets and suspended constitutional liberties of individuals in El Salvador, he has managed to arrest more than 70,000 people, including criminals from neighborhoods that were previously considered inaccessible and dangerous. This hardline policy has catapulted the president to popularity both within and outside his borders. With an impressive 85% of the votes, he swept the presidential elections of 2024, consolidating his power for another 5 years and leaving the opposition reduced to ashes. Salvadorans, relieved after decades of violence, have granted him absolute power. Bukele, capitalizing on his notoriety, has decided to carry out an authoritarian drift that has allowed him to control both the judiciary and the armed forces. In this way, El Salvador has gone from having the highest homicide rate in the world to one of the lowest in the region, with the controversial leader promising to achieve security statistics similar to those of countries like Canada. The impenetrability and grandeur of CCOT seem to fit perfectly with the personality of the president, whom some label as megalomaniacal. Accessing the Alcatraz of Central America is a daunting and oppressive experience. After passing through 4 checkpoints located in concrete rooms where officials with covered faces and a grim demeanor subject visitors to exhaustive body searches, one enters a world of darkness and claustrophobia. The security arches, equipped with X-rays, reveal even the most intimate anatomical details, preventing the trafficking of any item or substance. The resounding sound of the locks locking the iron doors reinforces a sensation of throat-tightening isolation. With 8 modules and a capacity for 40,000 people, the exact number of inmates is a closely guarded secret by CICAD authorities. No one who has crossed the doors of this prison in handcuffs has ever seen the light of day again. Only a breath of air sneaks through an opening in the roof, unreachable for the prisoners due to the smooth and tall walls. Behind those bars reside the most dangerous convicts in the country, hitmen with countless crimes to their name, serving sentences that, in the most extreme cases, reach up to 700 years. Let's see how the guards remind the inmates of their sentences daily.
Miguel Antonio, date vuelta, por favor. Pásate la camisa. Miguel Antonio Díaz Sarabia, alias Castor, activo de la Mara Salvatrucha, con el rango de gatillero. Uno de los casos que sucedió en octubre de 2016 fue la privación de libertad de 4 elementos de la Fuerza Armada, quienes después de gozar su tiempo de licencia se dirigían a su lugar de trabajo, fueron privados de libertad, posteriormente torturados y asesinados por estos sujetos, condenados a 269 años de prisión.
The eradication of gangs, a challenge that seemed insurmountable before Bukele's arrival, has resulted in a dramatic decrease in homicides and extortions in El Salvador. But this new sense of security comes at a price, one paid with the erosion of human rights and the shadow of a police state lurking on every corner. The accounts from the families of the inmates are chilling. The lack of contact with their loved ones, arbitrary detentions on vague charges such as illicit association, or simply for having tattoos. Those who bear these ornaments on their skin hide in their homes, fearful of becoming the next victim of a police raid. Lawyers arrive with release orders for their clients, only to be rejected and sent back the next day. And in the dark interior of the prisons, mysterious deaths and the unknown number of innocent incarcerated serve as a constant reminder of the dangers of living under an authoritarian regime. Amnesty International, one of the world's most important human rights organizations, condemns Bukele's actions and demands the prompt release of these individuals. However, the president is clear about his priorities, as highlighted in the following speech.
Por ahí andan rumores que quieren empezarse a vengar de la gente honrada, al azar. Hagan eso y no va a haber un tiempo de comida en las cárceles. Uno. A ver cuánto tiempo duran sus homeboys allá adentro. Les juro por Dios que no comen un arroz. Y vamos a ver cuánto tiempo duran. Y no me importa lo que digan los organismos internacionales, que vengan a proteger a nuestra gente. Que vengan a llevarse a sus pandilleros.
All of this happens while the young and charismatic president continues to be praised by the majority of the population for his tough stance against the gangs. Behind his image of a strong and determined leader lies hidden anger and impulsiveness, which are only evident when listening to him speak in his fiery speeches. Surrounded by advisors and marketing experts, Bukele clings to his figure of infallibility, while challenges and criticisms continue to grow against him. As we have established throughout this video, doubts, controversies, and complaints abound in El Salvador due to the controversial actions of the government. From renowned human rights organizations to American and European governments, all condemn the violent procedure that Bukele himself and his staunchest followers continue to defend as the path to rebuilding a nation where one can live without fear. In a country that has gone from being one of the most violent in the world to one of the safest in the region, it's worth asking, at what cost has this supposed peace been achieved?
En muy poco tiempo, El Salvador pasó de ser la capital mundial de los homicidios, pasó de literalmente ser el país más peligroso del mundo a ser el país más seguro de América Latina. Ya no es una promesa, es una realidad que están viviendo los salvadoreños.
After El Salvador reached its peak of violence in 2022, President Nayib Bukele's government set out to reverse the criminal situation in the country. To do so, it declared a state of emergency and began a war against the most dangerous gangs in the territory. As if by magic, the word security began to become more frequent among the population. This was because around 70,000 criminals belonging to the Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18 gangs were imprisoned. This led to the fulfillment of the promise made by the man known as the world's coolest dictator to bring peace of mind to Salvadorans. However, it also implied the disappearance of human rights when it came to incarcerating criminals and suspects. In today's video, we're going to immerse you in this battle against insecurity, so you can feel firsthand what it would be like to live the life of a gang member in Bukele's El Salvador. Inhuman treatment, a mega prison where days pass without seeing sunlight, and the high price one must pay for having ventured into the path of crime. Get ready for real danger, because here we go. March 2022. Multiple days of violence in the streets escalate the war between authorities and gangs to another level. 62 murders occur in just one day, marking a new and terrifying record. This is the final warning before stricter measures are decided upon. The government of Nayib Bukele declares a state of emergency, a regime that grants greater powers to security forces to carry out arrests. Soon, this decision will be the main cause of the downfall of thousands of criminals, but at the expense of a huge array of controversies. As its name suggests, this measure is unique in nature and can only be carried out in an exceptional situation. No one could oppose the idea of combating the overflow of violence, but the methods used quickly caught the attention of human rights organizations. To begin with, under the new legislation, the government suspended the freedom of association, thereby prohibiting gatherings in public places. Additionally, the right to know the reasons for which a person is detained and the right to have the assistance of a lawyer were also nullified. As if that weren't enough, the 72-hour deadline for preventive detention was extended to 15 days, and authorities were allowed to intercept correspondence and cell phones of those considered suspects. Think about it this way. You're a suspected criminal in El Salvador who has just been arrested. You won't be able to have a lawyer to defend you, and you won't even know the reason why you ended up in jail. Furthermore, you'll face a long time behind bars until your final fate is determined. All these extreme measures exist for one reason: to combat the most ruthless criminals in the country. Below, you can see how these mafias infiltrate the population and plunge people into a life where killing is an everyday occurrence.
¿Matarías por la 18?
Maté por la 18 y me muero por la 18. Ahora ya no mato por la 18, pero sí, quiera sea o no, este número me lo puse, no me lo puedo quitar. Entré a la pandilla, no me puedo salir de la pandilla. Prácticamente voy a morir por la 18, en que no ande haciendo cosas ya por la 18.
But these groups didn't always have such power. Let's learn about their histories. The most fearsome criminal organizations in El Salvador are the Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18, two rival gangs that originated in the United States. Political instability and internal wars in various countries of Central America caused Salvadoran citizens, as well as those from Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, to migrate to American soil. They primarily settled in Los Angeles, where in the 1980s the first Maras were formed to protect themselves from criminals of other ethnic backgrounds. Later on, in 1992, violent clashes between these groups led to the toughening of laws. Since then, it became permissible to try minors as adults, and deportation was also facilitated. As a result, many gang members ended up in prisons and were later deported to their countries of origin. Back in their home country, the experience of a violent life within organized crime led criminals to find in their native land the perfect context to continue growing. Both the Mara Salvatrucha, also known as MS-13, and Barrio 18 or M18 were the groups that grew the most in El Salvador and unleashed their own war against each other and against the authorities. Additionally, for years, they have been involved in drug trafficking in the region, often cooperating with Mexican cartels such as Los Zetas or the Sinaloa cartel. Gang members are distinguished by the peculiar tattoos covering their faces, and they are also characterized by the use of secret languages that only they understand. Nonverbal communication predominates, sending messages through the color of clothing or hair, gestures, graffiti, or artifacts left in special places. To be part of these groups, it's necessary to undergo initiation rites that test levels of violence. Those who want to belong to any of these organizations are forced to commit crimes, including murders. Now the question is, how did the lives of these gang members in El Salvador transform under Bukele's regime? Imagine this scenario. You're gathered with some colleagues and suddenly a blow from behind knocks you to the ground. A police officer on your back prevents you from moving and handcuffs you. Absolutely nothing you say will matter. They can do whatever they want with you and neither you nor anyone else can stop them. Just like the testimony you heard earlier, the tattoos on your body indicate that you were once part of a dangerous gang and now it's your turn to experience terror. This is how you will be transported to the mega prison built by Nayib Bukele, which was used to incarcerate a large portion of the 70,000 criminals detained by his government. It's called the Counterterrorism Confinement Center, also known as CCOT, located 74 kilometers from the capital city of San Salvador in the Tecoluca Valley next to the Chichantepec volcano. The prison was built in a record time of 7 months, and to carry out this project, the state bought 166 hectares of land. Within this space, 8 pavilions were erected, which are enclosed within a perimeter surrounded by an 11-meter-high concrete wall that is 2.1 kilometers long. Additionally, the place is also protected by electrified fences and guarded both day and night by 600 soldiers and 250 police officers. To give you an idea of its size, the mega prison is the size of 7 soccer fields. Each pavilion has a construction area of 6,000 square meters, and in each of its 32 cells equipped with steel bars, 80 inmates can be accommodated. If you are, were, or are simply presumed to be a criminal, that will be your destination. So let's see what amenities you can expect. When it comes to sleeping, you'll find that the beds are made of iron sheets without mattresses or pillows. A cold and hard surface to start and end the day. Furthermore, don't get excited about the possibility of going beyond the bars. The CCOT doesn't have recreational areas for sports or simply stretching your legs. If you exceed the permitted limits, the pavilions are also equipped with so-called punishment cells, dark and windowless. There, the life of gang members with bad behavior is reduced to 4 walls, and they can't even see sunlight. Additionally, in this case, the bed becomes simply a cement platform, so it's like sleeping on the floor. Upon entering the Counterterrorism Confinement Center, both inmates and security administrative personnel have to pass through registration areas before crossing 3 fortified gates controlled by guards. Likewise, every gang member who arrives must go through a body scanner and wait in an area where they will then be photographed. Images of those transferred to the CCOT also show that all criminals arrive wearing shorts, bare torsos, and no footwear on their feet. This way, when you find yourself inside this place, you'll only be a number, impossible to distinguish from any other prisoner. As mentioned earlier, the prison hasn't been built with courtyards, recreational areas, or conjugal spaces. Criminals only leave their cells when they go to a room for their virtual judicial process. Imagine experiencing it firsthand. Each of your days will be the same as the last, an endless punishment. Beyond this, it doesn't mean that the hundreds of guards aren't prepared to withstand possible riots. Security personnel are armed at all times with pistols and assault rifles, supplemented by electronic equipment that blocks cell phone signals, preventing communication from the prison. If you're the one on the other side of the bars, you'll need to be very careful because the prison staff won't hesitate to use everything at their disposal to punish you. The authorities assure that this prison is where all the criminals who planned the mourning and pain against the Salvadoran people serve their sentences. In addition to admitting that the price will be the harshest regime, they promise that the gang members will no longer walk away and will pay for what they are: cowardly terrorists. This policy aims to ensure that the members of the savage gangs get what they deserve, a sentence that they must pay in a maximum security prison. According to the country's regulations, inmates can serve sentences of up to 30 years in this prison, so if you are one of them, you will have a long time living in inhumane conditions. Nearing the end, we will tell you more about the numerous criticisms of the harsh regime in El Salvador, where complaints of human rights violations are constant. Among a long list, Amnesty International expressed its deep concern about Bukele's strict prison and called on the president to change course in his policy of mass arrests. According to the organization, this activity can only lead to an increase in abuses of power. In addition, they indicated that gang violence in the country must be addressed comprehensively, guaranteeing the rights of the entire population. Another entity that raised its voice was the NGO Human Rights Commission of El Salvador, which criticized the mega prison, pointing out that it is a shame for the country. They stated that the government boasts of having the largest prison in Latin America, which should not be seen as pride, but as a fact that entails risks of overcrowding and violence.
Hombre, perro, hombre, ¿cómo te vas a entregar? Esa es la peor pendejada que puedes hacer si sabes que te van a hacer. También, hombre, aguantala, hombre. No ya andamos viendo eso, pues mira, pues, si no yo les voy a mover unas varas, hombre, para que se suban, pero de una vez, carnal, porque si te agarran te van a matar, pendejo. Por lo mismo no te metas en el alucín y te ahueves en el sistema de que vamos a hacer las ondas bien, carnal, las vamos a hacer bien. Vos solo tenés paciencia, tranquilo. Por el momento, hombre, si ya tenés el rampla, ahorita estamos viendo para que te vayan a traer. Mira, pues si es posible de que le demos el cohete al compadre, pero te traes el cohete, no hay pedo. Oíste, si es posible que les dejemos el cohete a esos perros ahí, para que a huevos, por que los pasen, no hay pedo, hombre, de todos modos el cohete es de ustedes.
What you just heard is a call between maras. These are the fearsome gangs of El Salvador, which are part of the most dangerous criminal gangs in the world. Their presence caused the homicide rate in the Central American country to reach 106 per 100,000 inhabitants in 2015. However, in 2023, the number of murders dropped to the incredible figure of 2.4 per 100,000. But how did this happen? The heavy-handed regime against crime applied by the Nayib Bukele government has completely changed the reality of organized crime in El Salvador. And that is why, in this new military force video, we will discover how it works. We will investigate the controversial laws that have generated complaints from human rights organizations, and above all, we will learn about the operations carried out by the security forces to catch the brutal gang members. On June 1, 2019, Nayib Bukele became president of El Salvador with a difficult promise to keep: to crack down on the country's infamous and dangerous gangs. Many previous administrations had tried, but none had succeeded. Since the early 2000s, security forces had arrested members of these criminal organizations en masse. Politicians sent waves of police and soldiers into the streets to clear the gangs from poor urban communities where the government had lost control. Yet somehow, they would regroup and return with greater power and far more violence. None of the gains made in that period lasted, but the new president would finally bring about change, as real as it was controversial. In March 2022, El Salvador experienced one of the deadliest weekends in its recent history. Between the 25th and 27th of that month, 87 homicides were recorded across the country. This sudden increase in violence was attributed to gangs, mainly Mara Salvatrucha, also known as MS-13, and Barrio 18, which have historically had a great influence on Salvadoran crime. President Bukele reacted quickly to this situation by asking the Legislative Assembly to implement an exceptional regime. This was a request with great weight because the measure implies, among other things, suspending some constitutional rights and granting exceptional powers to the security forces. Beyond generating doubts in a large part of the population, the president obtained the support of the legislators, and with the new regulations, arrests and operations against the gangs began to be carried out.
Otro equipo pudo localizar a uno de los miembros de las pandillas. Será subido a una patrulla y llevado a la delegación para ser presentado junto a los demás detenidos.
Under this exceptional regime, the Salvadoran government has adopted a series of strong measures. Since its implementation, thousands of people have been arrested, many of them without a court order. The state claims that these arrests are directed against gang members and people associated with these criminal organizations. But there is no obligation to give explanations to people who are deprived of their freedom beyond a simple suspicion. In addition, extreme restrictions have been imposed in prisons, such as the confinement of prisoners in their cells, the suspension of visits, and the cutting off of communications. In addition, harsher penalties are imposed for crimes related to gangs. According to the government, the main objective of this regime is to combat the violence generated by criminal groups, reduce crime, and restore security and order in the country. To achieve this, the regulation was initially declared for a period of 30 days, but has been indefinitely extended for more than 2 years. As mentioned above, there is compelling data on the effectiveness of the Iron Fist model, such as the homicide rate. However, the measures have also generated a number of controversies and criticisms both inside and outside El Salvador. National and international human rights organizations have denounced abuses committed by security forces, including arbitrary arrests, illegal detentions, torture, and ill treatment of detainees. In addition, they have reported cases where people without gang ties have been arrested. Furthermore, many of those arrested have not had adequate access to legal defense. Some were even held in preventive detention for prolonged periods without trial, which goes against international human rights standards. Likewise, critics of the Bukele government argue that the regime of exception has been used as a tool to consolidate power and silence political opponents. The state is accused of using the fight against gangs as a justification for repression and the limitation of civil liberties. The global movement Amnesty International has been one of those to echo these issues, pointing out that there are 327 cases of enforced disappearances and 235 deaths in state custody. It also noted that the prison population has risen to 102,000 people, a high figure for a country of just 6.3 million inhabitants. In fact, these numbers mean that almost 2% of citizens over the age of 18 are behind bars, the highest prison population rate in the world.
En algunos de ellos se puede observar los tatuajes de la pandilla a la que pertenecen. Los detenidos son 18 sureños y MS-13. Lo que más sorprende es la edad de ellos, desde menores hasta personas adultas, y no solo hombres, también mujeres, las cuales tienen ciertas funciones dentro de la pandilla.
Despite the criticism, the state of emergency has also had broad support from a significant part of the Salvadoran population. They perceive the measures as necessary to restore security and reduce the influence of the gangs. Many inhabitants of the country said they feel safer and therefore support the government's actions. The feelings of the citizens can also be better understood if we put them into some figures. An investigation estimated that in El Salvador, there were about 120,000 gang members, including members of the Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18. They came to dominate 80% of the country's territory with their criminal activities. Robbery, extortion, kidnappings, and drug trafficking, however, in just over 2 years of the state of emergency, more than 78,000 of these criminals have been arrested, confiscating almost 4,000 weapons, some of them for military use. This meant a hard blow for the organizations, which lost more than half of their men on Salvadoran soil. Now, at this point, we will fulfill our promise to learn about the operations carried out by the Bukele government to capture these ruthless criminals. The missions against the gangs are characterized by being intensive, broad, and coordinated between various state security forces. They are mainly in charge of the National Civil Police and the armed forces of El Salvador, known as the FAES.
Unos oficiales llegan a las casas o a los lugares donde están viviendo las personas y previamente piden que se identifiquen, que les enseñen los documentos, que vean que no tienen a alguna persona que sea miembro de alguna pandilla. Este operativo es muy grande, es muy fuerte. De hecho, estamos escuchando algunos cohetes, son cohetes, no son detonaciones, pero los cohetes inclusive podría ser algún tipo de anuncio o de mensaje que pueda hacer entre las pandillas de decir, aquí hay un operativo.
This type of strategy seeks to maximize response capacity and territorial coverage, using the largest number of police and military personnel available. An example of this was the security cordon that was set up in the Central Department of Cabañas in August 2023. As part of a new offensive in the war against gangs, the government deployed 7,000 soldiers and 1,000 police officers around the entire territory. This action was in response to reports of an increase in criminals in the area during the previous weeks. Thus, the large-scale incursion was carried out with the aim of cutting off all the gang's supply lines and preventing the escape of members who wanted to escape. Although no figures were given on the number of people who were arrested with this operation, the government assured that it was another successful mission against insecurity. With the same dynamic, Bukele has proposed cleaning up each region of the country where the presence of these criminal organizations is distinguished, and another case was that of the municipality of San Martin. Crime had reached incredible levels there before the raids, and one journalist who visited the region admitted,
estar ahí antes de este régimen de excepción era casi imposible, debido a la alta presencia de pandilleros. Y la única forma de salir era sin tus pertenencias o sin vida. Estos operativos se realizan sin un aviso previo, aunque se sabe que hay personas llamadas postes que se dedican a avisar a los demás sobre la presencia de los elementos.
The tactic of establishing security cordons in areas identified as gang strongholds is one of the most common. This has been successful in clearing neighborhoods, colonies, or even entire municipalities, as in this case. However, blocking entrances and exits to prevent suspects from escaping is not enough. Security forces must conduct house-to-house raids in search of gang members, weapons, drugs, and other items linked to criminal activities. These actions are quick and forceful, with the goal of surprising the gangs and minimizing the possibility of resistance or escape, even when they have an informant who tries to warn about the state's presence. Another fundamental part of this work is the process of intelligence and data analysis to identify members of criminal organizations and their places of operation. The information can come from various sources, citizens and former gang members who collaborate with the police in exchange for protection, study of crime trends in an area, or social media monitoring and wiretapping like the one we hear at the beginning of the video. Beyond this work, the controversial regime of exception also allows authorities to carry out arrests without the need for a prior study or a court order. This has resulted in numerous arbitrary detentions, where people are captured based solely on suspicion, a neighbor's complaint, or simply for being in areas controlled by gangs. On several occasions, arrests are made in large groups and people are taken to detention centers to be processed.
Una vez que ya fueron identificados, que fueron detenidos, bueno, ahora ya pasan a estas celdas, donde por lo que nos comentaron también están divididos pues por pandillas, para ahorita no causar alguna controversia, alguna riña entre ellos.
Groups of prisoners like this are also the result of two other aspects of the work of the state security authorities. The first has to do with high-impact operations. These are missions carried out by members of special units of the police and the armed forces, and which are aimed at leaders or important members of the gangs. These are another type of raids which involve greater risks and require great precision. They are often carried out during the early hours of the morning to take advantage of the element of surprise in their favor. And finally, the other aspect is the technology at the commandos' disposal. The government has used advanced tools, such as drones and aerial surveillance, to monitor areas controlled by the gangs and better coordinate operations. These devices allow for a panoramic view of the areas of operation and to detect suspicious movements from the air. The last key to successful work.
Los militares cuentan con drones altamente equipados, los cuales les permiten observar desde el aire cualquier movimiento e intento de escape. Estos drones tienen cámaras térmicas, luces potentes y un altavoz que permite dar indicaciones. Complementado con el equipo en tierra, es casi imposible que su objetivo se fugue.
All of these factors have proven effective as tens of thousands of criminals have ended up behind bars. Brutal gang members who were used to facing down the authorities now fear a regime that turns a deaf ear to the demands of human rights organizations. That is why violent shootouts have become rare. On the contrary, the Maras that were once the hunters have become the prey, and all they are looking for is a way to hide. Their ability to do this comes from a combination of knowledge of the terrain, community support, and cover-up tactics developed over years of criminal activity. Historically, they have taken refuge in neighborhoods and colonies that they control or where they have a strong presence. In these areas, gang members often have the support of some residents who can act as lookouts or informants, alerting them to the presence of security forces. In addition, in these places they know the territory well and use previously prepared escape routes and hiding places to avoid capture. However, we have already seen that the Bukele government has managed to counteract these systems and cleanse entire municipalities of criminal organizations. This is why the Maras must get more creative. When pressure from the authorities is intense in urban areas, gang members often take refuge in rural and mountainous areas. In these places, they use the rugged and forested terrain to hide and move undetected. The landscape also provides them with a certain distance from police and military surveillance, making it more difficult for security forces to track them. Although little by little the state was adapting to dominate this scenario as much as any other.
Muchos han abandonado las ciudades y buscado refugio en las montañas. Las autoridades les han dado persecución con estos vehículos militares especiales todoterreno, dotado con drones y cámaras infrarrojas. Como resultado, reportan el desmantelamiento de unos 150 campamentos al estilo guerrilleros, donde los pandilleros se escondían junto con sus armas, incluyendo fusiles y municiones.
The presence of operations like these makes it impossible for the Maras to remain still in one place. In this way, the gang members continue to use caves and other natural shelters, but only as temporary hiding places. In this way, they manage to obtain a position that is difficult to detect from the air and with good cover against ground search operations. However, they must remain on the move, and that is when they expose themselves to being caught. Something similar happens with tunnels in the sewer or drainage system in urban areas. They function as temporary hideouts to avoid patrols, but in the long run they are not a 100% safe place. When left without alternatives, some gang members have chosen to hide among the crowd. They take shelter in bars, markets, or workshops that belong to a member of the criminal organization. By functioning as a facade of legality and normal activity, it can make detection by the authorities difficult. In addition, by being in urban areas with many people, they believe it is possible to camouflage themselves among the population. However, when persecution comes, there seems to be no place to hide.
Este permaneció durante varios días escondido dentro de un barril. Al estilo El Chavo del Ocho, otros han sido encontrados en medio de ladrillos, dentro de cajones de muebles de sala, en pilas llenas de agua, cuevas y hasta cubiertos de alimento para animales.
¡Mano al cuello, pues! ¡Mano al cuello, pues! ¡Mano al cuello, pues!
Ultimately, the only option that has brought some peace of mind to the criminal groups has been the possibility of leaving the country. Networks with other criminal organizations abroad have allowed some of the gang members to leave El Salvador. Once they have managed to cross the border, the only thing left is the fear of being caught as an illegal and being extradited to their country of origin, where the reception will be brutal.
Han llegado los detenidos de la comunidad en la que nos encontrábamos. Llegaron justo a tiempo para la presentación de todos los detenidos del día. En este lugar de la delegación es donde se toman las imágenes oficiales que serán subidas a las redes sociales para mostrarle al país y al mundo que esto no es un juego.
As we come to the end, we must point out that the influence of the state of exception in El Salvador has been enormous. Crime has dropped in an unimaginable way, and the government of President Nayib Bukele celebrates the success of its iron-fisted management. However, there is also concern about the long-term impact on democracy and the rule of law in the country. Critics argue that the measure sets a dangerous precedent and may lead to a more authoritarian government that is less respectful of human rights. In short, the effectiveness in reducing levels of violence and crime does not make the regime exempt from controversy.
Va todo el ejército para adentro, el ministro ese, Monroy, con todas las Hilux, van pero son un reverbo de soldados.
What you just heard is the voice of a Salvadoran gang member who was monitoring all the movements of the Minister of Defense Rene Monroy and his security detail in order to carry out a large-scale attack. Since Nayib Bukele assumed the presidency on June 1, 2019, the state has been in open war with organized crime. The president forged his reputation hunting down the Maras, the wild gangs that have tormented the country for decades with robberies, murders, and torture of innocent people. Although the fight seems to be favorable for the state, these criminal groups are a fierce enemy that must be constantly guarded against, which is why Bukele has a complex and extensive anti-gang protection protocol. In this new installment of Military Force, we suggest you enter with a VIP pass to learn in detail how the guards, police, and military defend the life of the President of El Salvador, despite the terrible mortal cost that this entails.
Buenos días, señor Presidente de la República y Comandante General de la Fuerza Armada. Le doy parte que la Fuerza Armada está lista para el saludo militar, por lo que respetuosamente solicito su autorización para dar inicio al saludo militar.
Está autorizado, general.
Está bien, señor Presidente, vamos a iniciar.
What we saw on screen is material recorded during Nayib Bukele's second presidential inauguration, which took place on June 1, 2024, marking the confirmation of the popular support that his administration has received, mainly in terms of security. In the not-so-distant past, the country's streets were owned by unscrupulous gang members who held the population hostage to their criminal practices. Robberies, torture, and kidnappings were the order of the day. In 2019, everything changed drastically with the measures taken by the new Salvadoran president, and this was reflected in his re-election. The event on June 1st, 2024 was massive and included the presence of political leaders and cultural figures from several countries. Security was strict and personnel from the different branches that make up the Salvadoran police were deployed, both to protect the president and to avoid any type of unrest among civilians. The result was a neat, uneventful event, a perfect image to broadcast to the rest of the world. However, not everything was rosy on that important date for El Salvador. A few days before the event, the National Police carried out an emergency operation to stop an alleged plot to place bombs in strategic areas throughout the country, a dark danger that brought to mind the darkest times the nation has experienced. Although the country has been making an extraordinary effort to control crime, it always finds a way to filter through. This was reported by news from around the world.
Ponemos el foco antes de nada en El Salvador. En Nayib Bukele está diciendo en las últimas horas que las autoridades han desbaratado un complot para colocar bombas en todo el país, coincidiendo con la toma de posesión del presidente Nayib Bukele el sábado. La Policía Nacional del país dijo que el complot involucraba a veteranos de la guerra civil del país de 1980 a 1992, una aparente referencia a las guerrillas de la izquierda.
As announced by the journalist, Salvadoran security forces arrested 7 leaders, identified as veterans of the civil war that bled the country for almost 15 years. On the night of Thursday, May 30th, 2024, officers entered the homes of 7 people accused of planning attacks that would be carried out while President Nayib Bukele was assuming his second term. The investigative process that resulted in these arrests was not revealed, nor is it known exactly what the clue was that allowed the attack to be thwarted. That is why different social organizations denounced the incident, alleging arbitrary arrests. According to the official report of the National Civil Police, or PNC, among those arrested was José Santos Melara Yanez, former deputy of the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, who held that position between 2015 and 2018. As we mentioned, the same security force announced the capture of 6 other historical leaders who had been in contact to carry out the detonations with explosives purchased on the black market. The detainees were grouped in what they themselves defined as the Salvadoran Insurrection Brigade, and their objectives were to destroy gas stations, supermarkets, and public institutions. After a few days, audio recordings were leaked that allegedly belonged to the terrorists during the planning stage.
Pero necesito que la prueba sí sea convincente y que, pero como te digo, la potencia no me gustó mucho. Unos funcionaban, otros no, entonces quiero que funcione totalmente, que no vaya a haber ni una sola falla.
Evidently, the man who left the message was not at all happy with the destructive power of the explosives he acquired, as he requested more conclusive proof of their capabilities. During the anti-terrorist operation, the National Police managed to capture part of the arsenal that was to be used by the aforementioned Salvadoran Insurrection Brigade. The evidence was found in the municipality of Guazapa, on the northern outskirts of the capital, an old guerrilla stronghold during the armed conflict that bled the country dry between 1979 and 1992, when the army fought against rebel forces seeking to overthrow the government. The arrest of the 7 attackers occurred a few days after the Popular Resistance and Rebellion Bloc, which brings together several social organizations and opponents of the government, stated that it did not recognize Bukele as president because he had achieved re-election through fraud. They argued that the politician's campaign was marked by the persecution of people and groups critical of his government. This is a symptom of previous disagreements between Bukele and these sectors. For some time now, veterans of the armed forces and former guerrilla fighters have positioned themselves as opposition to the ruling party for not having made room for their demands for an increase in pensions for families of the deceased and a preferential credit fund, among other demands pending since the 1992 peace accords. However, despite the threat of an attack and the multiple sources of hostility pointed at Bukele, the second inauguration of the president was carried out with complete tranquility, although with an impressive security deployment that showed that the president took the risk of a terrorist attack very seriously.
La seguridad para ingresar a la investidura presidencial era muy rigurosa con todo aquel que pasara los filtros, ya que durante este evento se recibe la visita de representantes de otros países como presidentes, mandatarios e incluso en esta ocasión un rey. Desde su llegada de estos invitados se pueden apreciar los protocolos de recibimiento. Algunos llegan en sus aviones y son bienvenidos con la Guardia de Honor de El Salvador.
The security protocol was taken to the maximum, both for the guests of honor and for the protagonist of the day. Keep in mind that among the list of attendees were the presidents of Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Uruguay, and Ecuador, as well as King Felipe VI of Spain. Each of them was assigned a special group of guards who accompanied them from the airport to the palace where the ceremony was held. According to reports in Salvadoran media, the operation was massive and was prepared for months to achieve absolute cooperation between the different agencies involved. And not only did they have the eyes and attention to keep the event out of danger, they also applied technology to avoid any unpleasant surprises.
Cada uno de los periodistas era revisado, y también del otro lado se hacía lo mismo con los ciudadanos que querían estar en la investidura. Los sonidos de los detectores no dejaban de sonar. No había excepción alguna.
Metal detectors are a fundamental first barrier at any event where Nayib Bukele is present. It is a quick and easy way to check that attendees are not hiding blunt objects under their clothing, which could then be thrown at the president. What is interesting is that the operation mounted by the president does not discriminate between civilians, journalists, and cultural figures. Everyone had to go through the same inspection measures. There were no privileges for celebrities or guests except for the leaders who attended the event. We mentioned the use of technology earlier, and perhaps the most striking example was the carrying of anti-drone weapons by security forces patrolling the perimeter.
También hubo elementos que portaban armamento especial para descender cualquier tipo de artefacto que se lograra ver en el cielo.
The image is quite curious since the devices look more like a weapon taken from a science fiction film, but contrary to what their futuristic silhouette suggests, they play a fundamental role in protecting the president from contemporary threats. Drones are the key weapon in all current conflicts. They are unmanned ships that, depending on the model, can carry a grenade to drop on the target or even transform into small remote-controlled missiles that hit a target determined by whoever controls their flight. The possibilities are endless, and if recent conflicts such as the war in Ukraine have shown us anything, it is that the impact of one of these devices is enough to blow a person to pieces. These curious instruments have a built-in radio frequency detector, or RF, to capture the signals emitted by unmanned ships when they are in the air. Its detection system is omnidirectional and is activated automatically when it detects its prey. It is then that a signal blocker is activated that can interfere with the communication of the drone with the device to which it is connected. When the aircraft loses that connection, it is forced to fly back to the takeoff point, or in the case of the most precarious models, to plummet to the ground. The officers did not let any suspicious objects pass, not even those that clearly belonged to civilians seeking to capture aerial images of the event. The fact is that today even models that are bought cheaply for filming or photographing can be adapted for acts of aggression. This type of rigor is just one more demonstration of the harshness with which the Bukele administration faces the threat of gangs. Images like the ones you just saw have become commonplace in the Salvadoran media. Since 2019, the government has waged a direct war to eliminate gangs, regardless of the human cost or the violence used to destroy these companies that trade in terrorizing the inhabitants. The process consisted of a multi-step plan that included mass arrests, seizure of property, and total isolation of apprehended criminals so that they could not continue committing crimes from prison. Institutions of confinement were no longer hotels with bars. They were transformed into sterile white cells where every disobedience is paid for with starvation and beatings. Even more extravagant actions were resorted to, such as destroying the graves of deceased gang members as a form of humiliation of their allies and subordinates. Bukele's methods and his justice system are extreme and have transformed him into the main enemy of criminal groups. Plans for murder, kidnapping, and attacks on family members have been reported, but none of these intentions were realized thanks to the actions of the police. The president's security is an absolute priority. If there is something that Bukele is specialized in, it is the use of social networks as a political instrument. In fact, a large part of his campaign for his first term was carried out via YouTube. Throughout his government, the president always maintained the control of insecurity as a priority. That is why he frequently visits places affected by gang violence, as well as the C-Cot, the impressive prison he built to house detained criminals. On one of his visits to these places of confinement, he walked through the corridors in which the terrorists will spend many years of their lives. At the same time, he was told about the security methods used there to have constant control of the activities of the inmates.
Sí, antes tenían a los pandilleros con prostitutas, con PlayStation, con pantallas, con drogas, con teléfonos, con celulares, con computadoras, y a los custodios y a los soldados los tenían durmiendo en el suelo, los tenían al revés.
Vamos a tener una vigilancia 24 horas al día, 7 días a la semana, con todo el equipo que está totalmente capacitado y donde tiene toda la indumentaria para su protección.
The interesting thing about these videos is that Bukele chose to appear without his personal security, accompanied only by the C-Cot staff and the workers who keep the detention center running. Of course, that was a message. With these men, even here I feel safe. The truth is that in general, the president always travels with highly trained escorts for all kinds of violent situations, be it assassination attempts or large-scale riots. Bukele's personal security follows him everywhere, especially to large public events where thousands of people gather. The operation may seem simple, but it includes guards, police officers, and members of the military who work together and in constant communication to avoid surprises. They know that their boss's main enemy is the dangerous Salvadoran gangs that, although they are in a time of clear weakness, still pose a high risk. Next, we will see a video filmed by a pedestrian who recorded the moment when the president arrived at the cemetery to visit his father. Several trucks and men get out of the vehicles to check that there are no suspicious passers-by on the streets. Only when it is confirmed that there are no Moors on the coast, Nayib Bukele gets out of his car, completely armored, and enters the place. This is a brief but accurate summary of how all presidential trips are carried out. Since his inauguration in 2019, the Salvadoran leader has not feared reprisals or personal attacks, even after facing the criminal empire of the Maras head-on. It is clear that undertaking a direct war against a criminal organization with such a scope and with such brutal practices implies a risk that the president must take into account every time he speaks in public. Even so, already beginning the second term of this controversial leader, the attacks and attempted aggressions have been partially stopped by the excellent protection provided by the police, the army, and his personal guards. However, there are no foolproof methods, and there is always the risk that the government's enemies will succeed in achieving their intentions. This brings us to the end of the video. If you like this content and are interested in learning more about similar topics, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. That way you can stay up to date with each of our news. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military Force. Thank you for joining us.